Anytime there were guests in my grandmother's house, mostly family and relatives, Granny insisted on feeding them in a big way. This was the epitome of who my Granny Maxwell was. A nurturer who didn't know or didn't care about the sugar diabetes, as they called type 2 diabetes in those days. She only knew how to feed a hard-working family and never strayed from creating abundance and putting it on the table. When I knew my grandmother, she had long silver hair past her waist. She had probably never in her life taken scissors to it. When there were other cousins around, we used to fight over whose turn it was to brush Granny's hair. I loved braiding it, which Granny would take and spiral it into a bun at the back of her neck. As she aged, her silver hair yellowed quite a bit, and her skin turned sallow. Years after Granny died, one of my cousins told me that she once witnessed a phone conversation between Granny and a telemarketer who was desperately trying to sell her magazines. Perhaps in an effort to offer something that Granny would be interested in, the telemarketer started asking some personal questions. What's your age? What's your occupation? Hobbies? And so forth. And then finally, the telemarketer asked hesitantly, "Ma'am, can you tell me, are you white?" Granny, holding out her arm to inspect her aging skin, said, "Well, I think most folks would call me kind of yellow these days." My cousin and I concluded that Granny was playing the telemarketer like a fiddle, especially for asking such a cheeky question. Granny was a kind and loving person, but had little patience for anyone who wanted to waste her time. She had quilts to sew and dresses to sew. She had gained a reputation as a fine seamstress in Plant City, and one of the few white dressmakers who accepted African American women as customers. Some of my family thought my grandmother was going too far to get business. You see, some of my grandmother's adult children, including my mother, were angry and humiliated that their mother was in service to women they thought should be subservient to them and their mother. This was the case in the 60s, and in many cases still is a sad legacy of the socially constructed racism of the South. In the very early colonial days, landed gentry desperately needed labor to get the tobacco and cotton gathered from their fields so that they can sell them to England. So they started engaging indentured servants, many of them lower classes, lower European, white Europeans, who were sometimes glad to go to get out of their situation. Others were duped into indentured servitude. And also there were very early on indentured African American servants. Now early on, white and black servants were not separated or even treated differently from one another. It wasn't until having their contracts broken and working under terrible conditions did white and black servants rebel together. Thus did the landed gentry realize they were seriously outnumbered. And so it was from then on, laws were put into place and white servants were physically separated from black servants. In addition, while white servants were given certain freedoms and privileges over black servants, especially once the plantations started to emerge and the buying and selling of enslaved people from Africa began in earnest. This great divide, created, fabricated, and constructed to keep black and white people separated, alien to one another, and subservient, both groups, to the landed gentry, still runs deeply, or at least it did then, in my ancestors south of the Mason-Dixon line. It is the reason Jim Crow laws arose post-construction. Poor whites did not want to lose their little bit of social standing. And unfortunately, that was true of some of my ancestors. Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow exist because of the treacherous seeds of classism and racism planted in the 17th century South. Now, I digress a bit, but it's important to what I believe of my grandmother. She was not doing any stooping for business. I know this in my heart and my soul. My grandmother was simply practicing the Jewish and Christian traditions of hospitality. If you needed a dress fitted or sewn, she would not turn you away any more than Abraham would have turned away the 3 strangers from his camp, and no more than Jesus would teach apathy and contempt for those in need. I believe my grandmother was an empathetic person who enjoyed a sense of accomplishment as a seamstress. She knew how to sew. She knew how to create beauty and abundance out of a bolt of cloth and provide it to her customers. Customers who might have had few options for buying a dress in that town, in that era. Now, mind you, my Granny Maxwell was not a saint. As a devout Pentecostal, she would not hesitate to tell me today I was going straight to hell in a handbasket for being a Unitarian Universalist and a non-believer. She would not think it would be appropriate for me to be a minister. Only men were ministers. She was known to be short-tempered and a little too free with a backhand to the cheek if you misbehaved. But again, this is the both and of the reality of life. Yet I choose to aspire to her personal and spiritual sense of nurturing hospitality. She truly cared for others and loved her family fiercely. Once my Aunt Loretta, her youngest daughter, called my grandmother in the middle of the night with worry over her son's dangerously high fever. He had the mumps. An hour later, my grandmother arrived at the door with the preacher in tow and set about praying for my cousin at the bedside until his fever broke the next morning. My Aunt Loretta was not thrilled about it, but I imagined my grandmother and this preacher praying in earnest over my cousin. And I'm deeply inspired. This is my deep inspiration for spiritual compassion. My grandmother clearly passed the hospitality gene on to me. When people come to my house and sit at my table, I want them to feel like there was no one more important to me in that moment. I too tend to cook too much. I'd much rather have leftovers than for any of my guests to go hungry. My door is always open. If you come to my door and I know who you are invited in. I have known neighbors who, when I knocked on their doors, would stand in their doorways and have a conversation with me. And while I respect their privacy, it's incomprehensible to me to act in that way. I'm grateful for the generous heart my grandmother gave to me. I can be no other way. What of your ancestors do you choose? What are you in receipt of from your ancestors? The larger values, the spiritual legacies. Rebecca Parker says, "We receive who we are before we choose who we will become." Does that ring true for you? Have you examined how this might be true for you? We often hear, "You have your father's eyes," or "You look just like your mother." But how often do we hear, "You have your grandmother's green thumb," or "Your great aunt was a feminist in her day too," or "You have your great grandfather's way with words"? In this month of looking deeply into our worship theme of ancestry, I invite you to look for the intangible spiritual values you are in receipt of from generations past in your family trees. I invite you to articulate what you find. Try them on and see how your worldview changes. In our society, we are vulnerable to the suggested values of a market economy, one that depends on dictating our needs to us rather than the other way around. To do this successfully, marketers depend on our disconnection and our dispiritedness, which we seek to assuage through material gratification or self-medication. I urge you to fight that path. Be countercultural. Seek the lifelines of connection with chosen ancestors who can give us a stronger sense of identity and genuine personal values. May your seeking be fruitful. May it be so.